Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. Okay, good morning. I'm so excited to kick off day 2 of the SPAN workshop. I feel like we've been having a lot of really cool discussions about fetal monitoring and labor, and so today I wanted to talk about maternal testimony, what the machine cannot hear. So to start off with, obviously I think everyone in this room is very familiar with these things, and these are all the signals that we do know, that we're very comfortable with. We know fetal heart rate, we understand uterine activity, we understand the role of maternal vital signs in assessing labor, we understand oxygenation, fetal movements, and even taking all of these variables and putting it into really cool multivariable risk stratification models and AI tools. So we understand all of this, and this is kind of the groundwork that I wanted us to think about, because then we can sort of say, yes, from a physiology perspective, we're fantastic at measuring these signals. We know what we want to do with them. So what about the signals that we fail to capture? And this is where I really want to bring attention to these ideas of maternal voice and maternal testimony. And I bring up both because I believe that there is a true difference between the two. Now, maternal voice is concentrated on the idea, the opportunity, and ability for women to express their concerns, preferences, and experiences during labor. And maternal voice is really central to ideas of respectful maternity care, shared decision-making, patient autonomy. So then how does that differ from testimony? Now, maternal testimony is the embodied experiential knowledge that's communicated by a mother, by a woman, about herself, her pregnant body, and her labor, and it has potential clinical relevance. So the questions that we must ask ourselves when we think about testimony are different than that we ask about voice. We need to ask, is this testimony credible? Does it constitute as evidence, and in what way? How does it influence risk assessment, and how does it alter clinical decision-making? But we have to look at the same story that we've been hearing for over 20 years. I'm going to focus on the NHS here, since we're in the UK. If we look at this history of maternity investigations, there's constantly this one thread that continues to reappear time and time again. This idea that nobody is listening to us. And by us, this is the patient voice. We see this in the Morecambe-Bay report, which came out in 2015. We see it in the original Ockenden report that looked at Shrewsbury and Telsford. Again, this idea that there was a failure to investigate, a failure to escalate, and a failure to listen. And we see moms commenting about, I felt frightened and I wasn't listened to during my birth. We see this in the Kirkup report looking at East Kent. Women know that they're experiencing at that moment in a way that a clinical attendant cannot, but there's still a failure to listen. And telling someone they must be wrong in this case is both disrespectful and dangerous. And the last report that was published just 2 days ago about Nottingham, again, a persistent failure to listen and believe mothers and fathers. So we have this problem that's going on in the NHS. It's also going on at the rest of the world as well. The US has a very similar problem, and I'm very familiar with that system, but it's also a problem around the world. So what do we do with it? When we know that 1 in 5 women report that their concerns were not listened to during labor. So do we ask ourselves, how do we listen better? This is the question that's been central to a lot of current maternity investigations, a lot of protocols, a lot of initiatives around communication. But I'd like to argue that no, that is the wrong question. We need to be asking ourselves, what exactly counts as maternal testimony? Because right now, if we're constantly asking ourselves, how do we make clinicians listen better, we're only looking at it as a communication problem. But really, it's an epistemic problem. And you see this because there's a lot of really interesting literature in the field that talks about this differential in terms of knowledge, perception, epistemic authority. This paper looks at risk perception, how it differs between midwives, pregnant women, and doctors. And what was so interesting is that within each group, everyone rated risk at the same as their peers, but between groups there was a huge difference in how risk was being perceived. Patients thought doctors would perceive risks higher than they actually did, and the lowest group to perceive risk was actually the physicians. You see this in the literature on obstetric violence and testimonial injustice, this idea that women are being undermined in their capacity to know. Their experiential knowledge is not being validated as a valid signal or a valid source. And so within this framework, you have this idea that this testimonial injustice occurs both as a result of the identity of a woman in a medical system, but also her identity as a laboring woman in the hospital. And it's one of my personal favorite papers. And you even have new frameworks coming out just a couple days ago looking at this idea that can we reframe this gut feeling? How do we feel in maternity? What does that look like? And it's not simply just an emotional signal. So ultimately, we have a consensus. This testimony matters. We need to be listening, but we need to question how we're listening. Because is testimony evidence? Is it intuition? Is it emotion? Is it lived experience? Is it a combination of all of these things and how it plays a role in how we perceive risk? And if you look at the rest of the literature, you can see attempts at defining maternal testimony across a variety of disciplines. So patient safety looks at it from the context of temporally, a lot of times women voice concerns prior to clinical deterioration. From a systemic perspective in implementation science, we think about the pathways that we can take to implement listening better. We think about philosophy, epistemology, bioethics. All of these disciplines attempt to look at the same problem of how can we listen better and differently. And so if we just look to a modern philosophy of testimony, testimony is at the core of medicine. Medicine is, yes, it's science, it's biology, it's the human system, but it's also an art. It's how we listen to one another. It's history taking, it's symptoms, it's pain. And so why does labor become this place where testimony is ultimately downgraded, dismissed, or entirely ignored? And so to answer that question, or at least partially answer that question, turn to this methodology called the dimensional concept analysis. And this is a theoretical groundwork methodology that really focuses on how can we answer these questions as a phenomenon. What all is happening here in the process of not listening to our patients? And so this methodology is rooted in social constructionism, pragmatism, and symbolic interactionism, because it's really focused on how do all of these components interact with each other. It's not as simple as a woman is voicing her concerns and a patient is not listening to her, but instead there is an ecosystem here when we think about maternity, when we think about labor, and those dimensions all interact uniquely and in a way that we have failed to understand. So I think if we're going to characterize any sort of phenomenon, we need to start with the history. And that starts all the way back, if we go to pre-1700s, this idea that birth was, as much as it is a physiological process, a socio-cultural process. It was this identity transformation. Women attended other women's births in their community. It was a place of co-created knowledge. The woman was at the center of her experience. And again, experiential knowledge was a big part of it. But again, as we move into modern time, which is kind of where we are here, we see the woman's voice getting lost. Ultimately, physician authority comes into play with innovation. We have the masculinization of the field. And of course, we have guidelines and protocols and monitoring technologies that help us move the field forward. But in doing so, we lose maternal voice. So then this brings me to sort of three key planes of analysis. And if you've noticed, I've sort of taken you through these planes with how I've structured this talk so far. We started talking about how do clinicians look at risk, how do they look at physiological indicators of risk, and then we've looked at the institutions such as the NHS and these maternity investigations. What's happening on the ground that's leading to these failures to listen, failures to act appropriately. And of course, we have this ethical and epistemic component. Where does this knowledge count? Who does it count for? How does it count, right? Ultimately, then, maternal testimony sits at the center of clinical and cognitive, epistemic, ethical, organizational, and systemic. It's this idea that we need to reframe how we're considering testimony, because if we look at it through just one of the lenses, we miss the transition point, right? If we were to just talk today, 30 minutes, about the epistemic nature of the injustice that happens in labor, we would miss this action point. How do we escalate? How do we act in an active system, a labor ward that is understaffed, overburdened, and managing multiple patients at once? Those are the real constraints of a system that is currently functioning the way it functions. So ultimately, the point that I want to make here is that maternal testimony is in and of itself its own valid clinical signal. And that's where we make this transition between just looking at maternal voice and we look at maternal testimony instead. And so the dimensional concept analysis has sort of led to this initial, kind of visual diagram of where exactly does the maternal body kind of situate itself in the labor ward. And you see these kind of concentric circles sort of coming out. And with the body, you have, of course, fear, pain, time, uncertainty. And then you have these layers, right? The clinical encounter as we know it. How does monitoring happen? What protocols are in place? Institutionally, what are we doing with hierarchy? How do midwives interact with obstetricians? What is there to be said about, this push towards a more defensive obstetric practice as we increase in litigation? What does that mean then in the context of the larger society and history that we live in terms of how obstetrics as a field even came to be? All of these things are, in my opinion, important for us to consider if we want to really question and improve the testimony of mothers in labor. And so why is listening to women as a kind of statement that we need to think about, as a policy, as the thing that we come out of these reports with not working for over 20 years? It's because we're looking at maternal voice and we're saying that it's synonymous to testimony, and it's not. It's a prerequisite to testimony, right? Because thus far we focus on things like an opportunity to speak. We've embedded birth plans and other forums for women to converse, and we've also looked at shared decision making as an option for listening to women. But there's a difference between having a space for them to listen and actually taking that knowledge and doing something with it. Ultimately, if we're thinking about next steps and final thoughts, since we've been really talking all day yesterday, and I'm sure all day today and tomorrow, the roles of technology, decision support, AI, this is the future. It's where the field is going to go. But if we don't ever consider maternal testimony as its own data source, it never becomes evidence, and it never becomes part of our new models. And so our listening problem in maternity is not simply a communication problem. That is how we've looked at it up until this point. It's how a lot of policies have looked at it. It's a lot of how advocacy organizations have looked at it. But ultimately, it is an epistemic problem, because the challenge in maternity is not simply getting women to speak. It's determining how what they say becomes something meaningful, a genuine signal to listen to and act. And so, ideally, with all of this sort of theoretical groundwork, I'd love to take this forward and consider a sort of longitudinal mixed method study that really evaluates these attributes of testimony, autonomy, risk, perceived risk, and clinical decision making sort of before, during, and after labor. Because if we don't properly capture the entire continuum of pregnancy, we're going to miss something very critical. So with that, I will really just, end on this point of, if maternal testimony is a clinical signal, then the failure to receive it, to weigh it, to act on it, is not a communication failure. It's a clinical recognition failure. So if we're going to continue pushing the needle forward in improving how we, handle clinical risk factors, how we diagnose, how we look at different moments in the clinical encounter, we need to consider testimony alongside those variables. And so with that, I'd like to thank my wonderful research group, my supervisor, Antonia, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. So thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Sahana. It was fantastic to woke us up, and I just love your passion and how angry you are, because definitely you're going to be able to change obstetrics with that attitude.
That's the hope and dream.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah, thank you so much. I didn't feel like there was an anger, certainly an excitement, which we need. To say, but I would love to hear maybe kind of a use case, if you will. What would be an example of a consequential, unheard voice in your experience and the knowledge of the literature where you feel like applying a way to acquire that voice, to listen to it, could make a difference?
Yeah, there's a lot of different examples and things. I think what was actually a really interesting case that I looked at kind of as far as sort of deriving those disciplinary planes was kind of this bioethical conundrum that happens in terms of the difference between antenatal and labor. And it was this thing called the Ulysses contract, which I'm not sure if there's any bioethicists in the room that are familiar with it, but it was derived from, Homer's Odyssey. And this idea that, this Ulysses contract is sort of this preemptive doctrine that you're sort of saying, this is how I want my clinical care to go, right? And oftentimes, we see this in a lot of areas of medicine. And there was this bioethical argument that we cannot consider maybe what a woman wishes or tells her partner immediately antenatally, and then not consider what she then wants and how that changes maybe during labor, right? So for example, an epidural is a fantastic example of this. A lot of women in their birth plans are like, I don't want an epidural at all, I want this natural birth without any pain medication, and then during labor, completely change their opinion. And so there was this debate of, okay, but do we respect this initial plan and this initial voice, or do we ignore it, right? And do we respect the preemptive choice, or do we respect what's being said in labor? So I think that that's an interesting example because it really points to how we need to consider labor as this really unique time period clinically, because it's this bit of a vacuum, right? You have the time pressure, you have the progression of labor that we're monitoring, you have the emotional arousal and the heightened sort of vulnerability that's happening there. A woman in active labor ideally can't just get up and leave if she really doesn't agree with her, clinician, which you can maybe in other cases of clinical context. So I think that's one example of sort of where does this testimony element play a role, because now she's speaking from her experience, right? Like the feeling of pain in labor and what that is changing in terms of her perspective on labor. So I hope that answers your question.
I do have one more, but probably not. But it's a call. I think so. Okay, awesome. So I have a suggestion. So I've been looking into the voice AI for a couple of years now. And so just on this keyword, do you think voice AI can be a practical answer to the fact that even if the laboring woman may have a change, the staff may take a while to get to it? I've actually been in this situation with one of our kids, and it's no fun. So just to say, there is a line here to walk between the privacy, the awareness that you have an AI sitting in the room, basically the ambient AI, right? It's not that new now. It's been a while.
Right.
But you get the realization that you will be heard at the cost of that everything will be heard.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's potential for it. I also think that there is this concern over what almost epistemic authority AI or other technology is going to take up in terms of that room, right? I think that, as we move towards a more technological approach to how we manage birth, technology is sort of this third party in the room, right? It dictates a lot of decisions, it kind of guides us. So I think there's a lot of really great potential with having these additional kind of voice tools or these, maybe apps or things that can kind of actively hear what the mom is feeling and how she's experiencing. But I think we need to be cautious in terms of how we implement.
Wonderful speech. I would suggest that maybe the most impassioned feedback that you get from mothers are those who are given emergency intervention for which there is neither preparation, and all of a sudden all manner of people are being mobilized and resources. And if there is any situation that is emblematic of the problem of the lack of understanding, lack of comprehension, and it is a lack of communication, obviously, because there's been no anticipation. As a comment, many years ago, I helped one of the original monitoring companies write a program for the automated analysis of fetal heart rate tracings. The code name was called Cuddly. Cuddly. And beside the activities with regard to the heart rate pattern, it had the option for maternal input into so that as a periodic estimate of the data, inclusion in the data, is the comments of the mother. And it seems to me that what you're dealing with mostly is what Malcolm Gladwell called the problem of too much knowledge and too little understanding. Very nice talk.
Thank you.
Yes. Last one? Yeah, you have.
Amazing presentation, thank you. Just quick question on, there's an assumption that first time women who are like going through a labor for the first time, there's an understanding to them that what accounts for their decision or opinion versus physician or midwife who is helping them. They have their experience and understanding. So how do you try to balance this gap of understanding of being included? And is there any evidence that has kind of created some knowledge on this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's actually a lot of really interesting analysis and literature on this natural power differential that occurs, right, between physician or clinician versus patient. And ultimately, the sort of balance between who's the expert in the room serves sort of different functions, right? Ultimately, you do want your doctor or midwife to be the expert and know how to manage labor, right? Because that's not what a first-time mom should be trying to do. So there's functionality in terms of that expertise. But I think the big point here in regards to how we conceptualize testimony is that there is a level of expertise in the knowledge that a woman experiences of her own body, right? So it's kind of balancing that those are two different sets of expertise that don't necessarily have to combat each other, but can instead be really complementary. And I think that what has potentially worked in some other, areas or clinics has been kind of this more cross-cultural exchange in terms of how those conversations are handled. I think, again, we see this fundamental breakdown in terms of what that looks like when we have emergency situations. So if a mom is being rushed to an emergency C-section, a lot of things are like very quick, it's very timely, it's urgent, and so as a result there's some shortcuts that are being taken in terms of explaining what's going on, and at that point the clinician's expertise is overpowering the mom's voice because it's like, we need to go, we need to do this right now. And so I think that, maybe there's a place for debate in terms of, do we have these conversations about the true risks of labor preemptive to labor, and what does that look like? And I think that that's why I brought up that risk perception article, because again, across the board, women scored so differently when it comes to their risks sort of in a general sense. So what about the specific risks of labor, right? Where do we draw the line between too much information too early, but they feel more informed and they're able to consent properly? Or do we just, kind of take this approach where they're allowed to be a little naive and we'll take it as we come and cross that bridge when we get to it? So I think that's a really big disciplinary question that I'm excited to explore with my PhD.